In the early months of 1942, the city of Brisbane found itself fundamentally transformed by the sudden arrival of thousands of American military personnel. As the threat of Japanese invasion loomed heavily over the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur established his general headquarters in this quiet Australian urban centre. The local populace initially welcomed the American troops as necessary saviors arriving to protect their vulnerable homeland. However, this massive influx of foreign soldiers swiftly disrupted the established economic and social equilibrium of the conservative wartime city, laying the groundwork for unprecedented and bitter friction. The demographic shift within Brisbane was staggering and immediate, drastically altering the everyday reality of the local residents. At its peak, the number of United States servicemen stationed in the surrounding areas reached roughly 80,000, completely overwhelming the local civilian population and infrastructure. Streets that were once quiet and distinctly Australian suddenly overflowed with olive-drab uniforms and the unfamiliar cadence of American accents. This rapid militarization created an environment of intense congestion, where resources became increasingly scarce and the physical space of the city felt entirely commandeered by the new Allied forces. A profound economic disparity immediately emerged between the visiting Americans and the local Australian population, generating a deep-seated and simmering resentment. United States military personnel were compensated with significantly higher wages compared to their Australian counterparts, possessing a purchasing power that locals could only dream of. The American soldiers freely spent their abundant dollars on entertainment, luxury goods, and alcohol, effortlessly driving up the cost of living for everyone else. Australian civilians and servicemen alike watched with growing frustration as their own standard of living deteriorated while the Allied troops lived in relative opulence. This glaring financial inequality translated directly into a fiercely competitive social dynamic, particularly concerning the attention of local Australian women. The well-funded American soldiers, often equipped with highly coveted luxury items like silk stockings, fine chocolates, and premium cigarettes, easily monopolized the dating scene. "The Americans are overpaid, oversexed, and over here," muttered a disgruntled local shopkeeper as he watched a group of confident soldiers laughing with young women. This pervasive sentiment accurately captured the bruised egos and genuine heartbreak experienced by many Australian men who felt entirely marginalized in their own hometowns. For returning Australian soldiers, the situation in Brisbane was deeply insulting and emotionally agonizing after enduring the horrors of combat overseas. Men like Gunner Edward Webster had survived grueling campaigns in the harsh deserts of the Middle East, expecting a hero's welcome upon returning. Instead, they arrived home to find their beloved city occupied by foreign troops who had seemingly taken their places in society. These battle-hardened veterans felt a profound sense of displacement and disrespect, as the newly arrived Americans appeared to be enjoying the spoils of a country they had not yet defended. The contrast in military presentation further exacerbated the growing divide between the two Allied armed forces stationed within the crowded city limits. The United States military supplied its personnel with custom-tailored uniforms that looked undeniably sharp and professional, projecting an image of undeniable power and wealth. In stark contrast, Australian soldiers were issued baggy, somewhat ill-fitting khaki uniforms that appeared decidedly inferior when compared directly to the Americans. This stark visual discrepancy served as a constant, humiliating reminder of the resource gap, making the Australians feel like second-class soldiers despite their extensive combat experience. Adding to the mounting tension was the distinct difference in military discipline and the operational style of the respective military police forces. The Australian forces were accustomed to a somewhat egalitarian approach to authority, valuing a sense of brotherhood and mutual respect among the ranks. The American military police, however, strictly enforced a rigid hierarchy and were heavily armed with batons and firearms during their routine urban patrols. This aggressive and highly visible display of martial authority deeply irritated the Australians, who viewed the American policing methods as overly authoritarian and unnecessarily confrontational in a civilian setting. Rationing policies implemented by the Australian government further highlighted the vast divide in living conditions between the local populace and the American troops. Everyday citizens faced severe restrictions on essential goods, including meat, butter, sugar, and clothing, as the national economy strained to support the war effort. Conversely, the American military logistics system ensured that its soldiers were provided with a seemingly endless supply of high-quality rations and consumer goods. The sight of Americans casually consuming imported delicacies, while locals struggled to secure basic necessities, bred a quiet but intense anger among the civilian population. Ted Webster, walking through the bustling streets of Brisbane, felt the heavy burden of this unfair reality pressing down upon his weary shoulders. It is our bloody country. Yet we are treated like strangers begging for scraps, he remarked bitterly to a fellow Australian soldier at a corner pub. The American soldiers brushed past them, their loud voices and confident strides dominating the narrow sidewalk, completely oblivious to the silent hostility brewing around them. Webster gripped his half-empty glass tightly, his mind flashing back to the blood-soaked sands of Tobruk, wondering what exactly he had fought for. The local public houses, traditionally the social centers of Australian male bonding, rapidly became primary flashpoints for these escalating cultural and economic tensions. Australian soldiers often found themselves entirely priced out of their favorite drinking establishments, as publicans naturally favored the highly lucrative American clientele. Fights over limited supplies of beer and seating arrangements began to break out with alarming frequency, transforming the once friendly pubs into hostile territorial zones. The military authorities attempted to segregate the drinking areas, but these measures only served to formalize the bitter division and foster deeper feelings of mutual animosity. A profound lack of understanding regarding each other's military cultures fueled endless arguments and physical altercations in the darkened streets of the city. The Americans often perceived the Australians as undisciplined, rugged, and somewhat backward, failing to appreciate their proven effectiveness in brutal guerrilla warfare scenarios. Conversely, the Australians viewed the Americans as arrogant, inexperienced, and entirely reliant on their superior equipment rather than actual combat skill. These damaging stereotypes, repeated and exaggerated during countless drunken arguments, solidified a wall of toxic resentment that neither side was willing or able to dismantle through peaceful dialogue. The United States military's establishment of exclusive facilities exclusively for their personnel further alienated the host nation and its proud fighting forces. Large recreational centers and highly stocked post exchanges were set up throughout the city, heavily guarded and strictly off-limits to any Australian personnel. These opulent establishments, shining like beacons of American prosperity in the middle of a war-rationed city, became enduring symbols of the perceived arrogance of the Allied forces. Passing by the heavily guarded entrances, Australian soldiers felt a stinging sense of exclusion that directly mocked their vital contribution to the ongoing global conflict. As the year 1942 progressed, the initial gratitude felt by the people of Brisbane had almost entirely evaporated, replaced by a tense endurance. The city was operating under stringent blackout conditions to prevent potential aerial attacks, creating a dark and deeply oppressive atmosphere that perfectly matched the local mood. In the shadows of these darkened streets, the underlying friction between the Allied forces festered, growing more volatile and unpredictable with each passing week. The High Command remained dangerously oblivious to the severity of this social crisis, focusing entirely on the strategic Pacific theater while ignoring the domestic front. Australian authorities found themselves trapped in an incredibly delicate diplomatic position, utterly unable to confront the powerful American military command about the deteriorating situation. The Australian government desperately needed the United States to defend the continent from the advancing Japanese forces, making them hesitant to criticize their vital allies. Police reports regarding assaults and public disturbances involving American personnel were routinely suppressed or handled quietly to avoid creating an international incident. This policy of deliberate appeasement left the Australian soldiers feeling completely abandoned by their own leadership, forced to swallow their pride for the sake of national security. By late November, the city of Brisbane resembled a highly pressurized boiler, requiring only a single spark to trigger a catastrophic social explosion. The psychological toll of the war, combined with the relentless economic disparity and bruised national pride, had pushed the Australian servicemen to their absolute breaking point. Something has to give eventually. They cannot push us around in our own backyard forever, Ted Webster whispered fiercely to his comrades as another American patrol marched past. The stage was undeniably set for a violent confrontation, an inevitable clash between allies that history would remember as the bloody Battle of Brisbane. The sweltering summer heat of the Queensland capital only served to amplify the irritability and discomfort of the tens of thousands of stationed troops. Packed into overcrowded military camps and forced to navigate a struggling city, the soldiers were constantly on edge, Minor disagreements over a bumped shoulder on the sidewalk or a misunderstood comment quickly escalated into furious shouting matches. The fundamental lack of recreational space meant that these frustrated young men were constantly forced into close, unavoidable proximity, virtually guaranteeing that a violent physical conflict between the Allied forces was always imminent and completely unavoidable. The situation reached a critical juncture when local criminal elements began to exploit the widespread chaos and the animosity between the two military groups. Black market profiteers actively sought out American soldiers, selling them illegal liquor at exorbitant prices and organizing underground gambling rings that frequently resulted in violence. Australian military authorities viewed these illicit activities as a direct insult to their jurisdiction, yet they lacked the necessary manpower and political backing to effectively intervene. The streets of Brisbane after dark gradually transformed into a perilous landscape where military law and civilian order continually clashed with devastating consequences. To the casual observer during the daylight hours, the Allied military partnership appeared robust, united firmly against the terrifying expansion of the Japanese Empire. Official propaganda continuously showcased smiling Australian and American commanders shaking hands, emphasizing a unified front and a shared democratic vision for the war effort. However, beneath this carefully constructed facade of international brotherhood, a toxic combination of envy, cultural misunderstanding, and territorial pride was silently corroding the relationship from within. The grand strategic alliance crafted by politicians in distant capital cities completely failed to account for the brutal realities experienced by the soldiers on the ground. As the days steadily marched toward the end of the year, the palpable tension became heavy enough to cut with a combat knife. Officers from both nations issued warnings and attempted to implement curfews, but these administrative measures proved woefully inadequate against the rising tide of visceral human emotion. Every night, the city held its collective breath, fully aware that a significant confrontation was no longer a mere possibility, but an absolute historical certainty. The foundation for a devastating internal tragedy had been flawlessly laid, waiting only for the fateful events of late November to ignite the powder keg. General Douglas MacArthur, completely insulated within his heavily guarded headquarters, remained largely disconnected from the grim reality unfolding on the local streets. His singular focus was entirely fixed upon the complex logistics of the massive Pacific military campaign, viewing the mounting civil disturbances as minor disciplinary issues rather than a severe systemic crisis. This profound lack of leadership regarding the crucial domestic situation allowed the dangerous animosity to grow unchecked and completely unmanaged. The ordinary soldiers were left to navigate this hostile emotional landscape entirely on their own, guided solely by their mounting frustrations and deeply bruised pride. Thus, the city of Brisbane stood precariously on the precipice of an unprecedented and utterly senseless internal conflict as the holiday season approached. The proud Australian veterans, fiercely protective of their homeland and their personal honor, refused to simply bow down to the overwhelming American presence any longer. Meanwhile, the well-equipped United States personnel, confident in their critical role as necessary saviors, completely failed to recognize the deep emotional damage their very presence inflicted. The tragic collision of these two immensely proud military forces was now entirely unavoidable, destined to forever stain the history of the crucial wartime alliance. The establishment of exclusive post-exchange facilities by the United States military served as a profound catalyst for the escalating anger within Brisbane. These heavily guarded stores, commonly known as the PX, were strategically located throughout the city to provide American personnel with a comforting slice of home. Inside these brightly lit establishments, soldiers could easily purchase heavily subsidized luxury items, including imported cigarettes, high-quality chocolates, and fine alcohol. For the local civilian population and the battle-weary Australian soldiers, these exclusive havens represented a glaring symbol of American privilege and blatant inequality during a period of severe national rationing. Australian troops were explicitly barred from entering these opulent American military stores, a policy that generated intense and immediate resentment across the Allied ranks. Men who had bravely fought alongside Allied forces in brutal overseas campaigns found themselves abruptly treated as untrustworthy outsiders in their own capital city. The sight of heavily armed American guards strictly verifying identification cards at the pristine entrances deeply offended the egalitarian sensibilities of the local servicemen. This rigid institutional segregation practically destroyed any remaining illusions of a unified military brotherhood, replacing genuine camaraderie with a toxic atmosphere of mutual suspicion and deep-seated jealousy. Beyond the blatant economic disparities highlighted by the exclusive military stores, the strict racial segregation policies enforced by the United States Army created profound cultural friction. The American military establishment insisted on exporting its domestic Jim Crow laws directly into the heart of the Australian wartime society. African American troops were systematically confined to the less desirable southern side of the Brisbane River, physically isolated from their white counterparts and the more prosperous entertainment districts. This aggressive enforcement of racial division was largely unfamiliar and deeply unsettling to the majority of the local civilian and military population. Interestingly, the Australian public and their military personnel frequently extended a much warmer welcome to the African American soldiers than to the white American troops. The local citizens generally perceived the segregated black servicemen as remarkably polite, genuinely humble, and entirely lacking the overbearing arrogance often displayed by the wealthier white units. Australian soldiers frequently observed the deeply unjust treatment inflicted upon these minority troops by their own commanding officers and aggressive military police units. This shared sense of enduring institutional mistreatment forged an unexpected but strong bond of solidarity between the Australian forces and the segregated American minorities. This unexpected cultural dynamic frequently resulted in highly volatile confrontations on the crowded city streets and within the dimly lit local public houses. Whenever aggressive white American military police officers attempted to harshly discipline or unlawfully harass African American soldiers, the observing Australian troops would almost instinctively intervene to forcefully defend them. "Leave the poor blokes alone, they are fighting the same bloody war as the rest of us," Ted Webster shouted during one particularly heated street altercation outside a local pub. These frequent and highly aggressive interventions completely infuriated the strict American military law enforcement personnel. Norbert Grant, a deeply committed and highly disciplined American military police officer, viewed these persistent Australian interventions as a direct assault on his legitimate authority. Tasked with maintaining strict operational order within a chaotic foreign city, Grant fundamentally believed that the Australian forces lacked the necessary discipline to properly fight a modern war. He viewed their egalitarian military culture and casual disregard for established rank structures with utter professional contempt and deep personal suspicion. For officers like Grant, the increasingly frequent street brawls were not merely cultural misunderstandings, but dangerous mutinies that required swift and overwhelming physical suppression. The profound philosophical differences in policing styles between the Allied military forces continuously exacerbated the rapidly deteriorating security situation across the darkened urban landscape. Australian military police, traditionally known as provosts, generally relied upon verbal persuasion and a strong sense of shared camaraderie to de-escalate tensions among their intoxicated fellow soldiers. In stark contrast, the American military police were heavily armed with large wooden batons and loaded sidearms, utilizing aggressive physical intimidation as their primary method of crowd control. This heavily militarized approach to local civilian policing deeply shocked and thoroughly alienated the fiercely independent Australian servicemen. Night after night, the humid air of the Queensland capital echoed with the chaotic sounds of shattering glass and furious shouting as localized riots erupted. The local pubs, already suffering from severe wartime supply shortages, transformed into dangerous battlegrounds where national pride and toxic masculinity collided with devastating force. A simple misunderstood remark regarding the quality of a uniform or a perceived insult directed at an Australian woman could easily ignite a massive and bloody brawl. The local civilian police forces were completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the violence, essentially abandoning the city center to the warring militaries. The deeply ingrained American military culture of carrying concealed civilian weapons further escalated the inherent danger of these seemingly spontaneous nighttime street confrontations. While Australian soldiers were strictly forbidden from carrying any personal firearms or large knives while off duty, many American servicemen actively ignored similar regulations without facing significant consequences. The sudden and terrifying flash of a drawn combat knife during a routine fistfight quickly transformed minor disagreements into potentially lethal encounters in the crowded alleyways. This severe imbalance of lethal force profoundly angered the Australian troops, who felt entirely unprotected and fundamentally disadvantaged in their own homeland. As the number of violent physical casualties steadily mounted, The top military commanders of both allied nations completely failed to effectively address the underlying systemic issues. General Douglas MacArthur remained deeply isolated within his heavily fortified command bunker, viewing the bloody street brawls as mere disciplinary footnotes in his grand strategic reports. The Australian High Command, paralyzed by their absolute strategic dependence on the United States Navy, actively suppressed accurate newspaper reports detailing the horrific extent of the urban violence. This deliberate policy of official censorship only intensified the furious anger burning within the lower ranks of the Australian military. Ted Webster and his battle-hardened comrades felt entirely betrayed by their own national government, deeply convinced that their honorable military service had been completely disregarded. The politicians have sold us out to the Yanks, and now we cannot even drink a pint in peace without getting our heads bashed in, Webster muttered angrily while nursing a bruised jaw. This pervasive sentiment of political abandonment rapidly infected the entire Australian military encampment, transforming isolated instances of personal frustration into a unified and highly dangerous collective fury. The men were quietly preparing themselves for a massive and inevitable physical reckoning. The American soldiers, conversely, felt incredibly unappreciated by the deeply hostile local population they had ostensibly crossed the vast ocean to bravely protect from invasion. They simply could not comprehend why their generous spending habits and sophisticated cultural offerings were met with such intense and openly aggressive Australian hostility. From their perspective, they were the undeniable saviors of the Pacific Theater, fully deserving of the utmost respect and the finest accommodations the grateful city could possibly provide. This profound mutual misunderstanding created a terrifyingly fragile environment where rational diplomatic discourse was essentially impossible and extreme violence became the only language. The deliberate physical segregation of the Allied military forces eventually extended far beyond the highly controversial and heavily guarded boundaries of the exclusive American retail stores. Distinctly defined geographical zones began to unofficially emerge throughout the city center, informally designating specific streets and public parks as the exclusive territory of one specific nationality. Crossing into these deeply contested urban territories without the protection of a large group virtually guaranteed a brutal physical confrontation with heavily intoxicated rival soldiers. Brisbane had effectively been partitioned into hostile, heavily armed neighborhood factions, resembling a divided war zone far more than a secure Allied sanctuary. This pervasive and terrifying atmosphere of constant urban warfare heavily affected the daily routines and the psychological well-being of the exhausted civilian population. Local women were frequently harassed or aggressively intimidated while simply attempting to walk home from their essential wartime factory jobs in the late evening hours. Honest shopkeepers were routinely forced to hastily board up their shattered storefront windows after yet another massive Allied brawl violently destroyed their valuable commercial property. The once peaceful and highly orderly society of the Australian city had been entirely shattered by the overwhelming presence of its supposed international protectors. The rigid enforcement of military discipline by the controversial American military police was consistently perceived by the Australian forces as a malicious display of imperial dominance. Norbert Grant and his heavily armed patrols frequently utilized aggressive physical force to violently subdue even the most minor infractions committed by Allied personnel. The sight of a fellow Australian soldier being brutally beaten with wooden batons by foreign military police officers triggered a deeply primitive and intensely protective rage. These brutal and highly visible public subjugations entirely erased any lingering feelings of international goodwill, effectively cementing the American forces as an occupying enemy. As the sweltering month of November relentlessly progressed, the heavily suppressed official military reports began to quietly acknowledge the terrifying severity of the ongoing urban crisis. Secret memorandums urgently circulated between the highest Allied command echelons, desperately warning of an impending and massive collapse of basic military discipline across the entire region. However, these highly classified internal warnings unfortunately resulted in absolutely no tangible policy changes or meaningful interventions on the increasingly violent and deeply segregated city streets. The bureaucratic inertia of the massive Allied military machine virtually guaranteed that the rapidly approaching social disaster would remain entirely unavoidable. The psychological pressure cooker of the overcrowded city was further intensified by the constant and terrifying threat of an impending Japanese naval assault on the coastline. The profound existential anxiety regarding the immediate survival of the Australian nation heavily permeated every single interaction between the exhausted soldiers and the terrified civilian population. This underlying atmosphere of immense national dread heavily shortened personal tempers and significantly amplified the perceived severity of every minor cultural slight or perceived diplomatic insult. The soldiers were effectively fighting a deeply exhausting psychological war long before they ever physically engaged the actual enemy forces. Ted Webster frequently gathered with his loyal infantry comrades in the shadowy corners of the remaining unsegregated public houses to bitterly discuss their rapidly deteriorating situation. They quietly swapped horrific stories of brutal American military police beatings and aggressively shared their deep mutual disgust regarding the perceived cowardice of their own political leaders. A highly dangerous and deeply unified consensus was rapidly forming among the fiercely proud Australian veterans regarding the absolute necessity of violently reclaiming their stolen national dignity. The scattered sparks of individual resentment were rapidly coalescing into a massive and entirely uncontrollable roaring fire of collective vengeance. Meanwhile, the dedicated American military police units actively intensified their aggressive nighttime street patrols in a desperate attempt to forcibly maintain control over the chaotic city. Norbert Grant rigorously inspected his heavy wooden baton and carefully loaded his standard-issue service weapon before embarking upon every single dangerous evening patrol shift. He viewed the deeply hostile Australian crowds gathering on the crowded street corners not as allied partners, but as a highly dangerous and completely undisciplined civilian mob. The tragic stage was now flawlessly and completely set for a massively violent and incredibly bloody confrontation between these two incredibly proud forces. The deeply flawed structural foundation of the grand international military alliance had completely fractured under the immense weight of petty jealousy and profound cultural misunderstanding. The optimistic political rhetoric regarding a united democratic front had been thoroughly completely exposed as a hollow diplomatic lie upon the violently contested streets of Brisbane. The profound historical tragedy of the rapidly approaching conflict was that both military factions genuinely believed they were absolutely and morally justified in their increasingly aggressive actions. This deeply terrifying absolute certainty in their own respective righteousness entirely eliminated any remaining possibility for a peaceful diplomatic resolution to the crisis. As the final week of November slowly dawned, a highly suffocating and deeply ominous tension firmly settled over the incredibly humid and heavily congested Australian city. The massive and heavily armed Allied military camps essentially resembled tightly coiled springs, requiring only the slightest physical provocation to violently and completely snap. The exhausted civilian population nervously barricaded their fragile wooden doors and cautiously shuttered their delicate glass windows, silently praying for a peaceful resolution that would never actually arrive. The invisible and highly volatile fuse of extreme urban violence had already been definitively lit, burning rapidly toward an explosive and terrifying conclusion. The American forces were eagerly preparing to joyously celebrate their traditional Thanksgiving holiday, anticipating a brief and much-needed respite from the horrific stresses of war. However, the deeply resentful Australian soldiers, entirely excluded from these lavish international festivities, viewed the upcoming foreign celebration with extreme suspicion and intense, burning hostility. For men like Ted Webster and the rigidly disciplined Norbert Grant, this specific holiday would permanently mark the devastating and incredibly bloody end of their fragile international brotherhood. The simmering resentments of the past year were about to violently erupt, forever changing the historical legacy of the city. The evening of November 26, 1942, descended upon Brisbane with a heavy, oppressive humidity that mirrored the boiling tensions. It was the American Thanksgiving holiday, a day traditionally reserved for expressing gratitude and enjoying abundant feasts with family and friends. However, for the thousands of displaced soldiers wandering the darkened streets, it merely amplified their profound homesickness and intense frustration. The American Post Exchange on Adelaide Street was particularly busy, serving as a heavily fortified oasis of luxury amid the bleak wartime rationing that strictly governed the weary local civilian population. As twilight deepened into a blackout-enforced darkness, the bustling intersection near the General Post Office became increasingly crowded with heavily intoxicated servicemen. American soldiers, flush with holiday pay and premium liquor, spilled out onto the narrow pavements in boisterous, celebratory groups. Watching them from the shadows were scores of Australian veterans like Ted Webster, their pockets empty and their fierce national pride deeply wounded by the blatant inequality. "Look at them parading around like they own the bloody place." Webster spat bitterly to his companion, his calloused hands involuntarily curling into tight fists. The spark that finally ignited this massive powder keg seemed almost entirely inconsequential in the grand scheme of the brutal global war. An intoxicated American soldier, stumbling clumsily along the crowded Adelaide Street, was abruptly intercepted by a heavily armed United States military police patrol. The military policeman harshly reprimanded the stumbling private, demanding his identification papers with a loud, aggressive tone that immediately drew the attention of nearby pedestrians. To the observing Australian soldiers, this routine disciplinary action looked exactly like another arrogant display of American institutional bullying right in their hometown. Without a second thought, several Australian servicemen instinctively stepped forward to aggressively intervene on behalf of the beleaguered and heavily intoxicated American private. "Why do not you leave the poor bastard alone? He is just having a drink," shouted one Australian infantryman, stepping directly into the path of the heavily armed guards. Norbert Grant, a deeply rigid and highly disciplined American military police officer, instantly bristled at this blatant and completely unauthorized foreign interference in his official duties. He firmly ordered the Australians to immediately step back and mind their own business before things quickly escalated. The direct confrontation rapidly escalated as the inherently dismissive tone of the American military police officer further infuriated the already deeply resentful Australian veterans. Ted Webster pushed his way to the front of the rapidly growing crowd, his face flushed with a dangerous mixture of cheap alcohol and immense righteous anger. "You Yanks think your badges give you the right to push everyone around," Webster aggressively challenged, standing mere inches from Grant's heavily starched uniform. The sheer physical proximity of the angry men created a terrifyingly electric atmosphere that practically guaranteed immediate violence. Grant instinctively raised his heavy wooden baton in a defensive posture, a standard crowd control tactic that was interpreted by the Australians as an imminent lethal threat. The sudden movement of the weapon triggered a massive and instantaneous physical reaction from the surrounding mob of fiercely loyal Australian soldiers. Fists began to fly indiscriminately through the humid night air as the vastly outnumbered American military police officers desperately attempted to defend themselves against the overwhelming onslaught. The chaotic melee instantly spilled out across the wide expanse of Adelaide Street, entirely halting all civilian traffic. Word of the violent street brawl spread through the nearby public houses and darkened alleyways with the terrifying speed of a devastating wildfire. Hundreds of off-duty Australian soldiers, desperate to vent their accumulated months of deep psychological frustration, sprinted eagerly toward the epicenter of the chaotic conflict. They viewed this spontaneous uprising not as a simple street fight, but as a desperately needed and highly justified rebellion against a deeply arrogant occupying foreign military force. The sheer volume of angry men surging into the narrow street completely overwhelmed any conventional attempts at restoring urban order. The heavily guarded American Post Exchange rapidly became the primary geographical focal point for the massive and increasingly violent Australian mob. The building represented everything the local servicemen had grown to fiercely despise about the deeply unequal alliance, standing as a pristine monument to foreign privilege. Angry rioters began hurling large rocks, discarded glass bottles, and heavy wooden debris at the fortified storefront, completely shattering the windows and terrifying the staff trapped inside. The sound of breaking glass echoed loudly down the street, serving as a terrifying, chaotic symphony celebrating the complete collapse of military discipline. Inside the besieged exchange facility, terrified American personnel frantically barricaded the heavy wooden doors and desperately telephoned their central command for immediate armed reinforcements. The situation had completely escalated beyond a mere fistfight, rapidly transforming into a highly dangerous and incredibly destructive full-scale urban military riot. Grant and his battered colleagues fought desperately to maintain a defensive perimeter around the shattered entrance, using their heavy wooden clubs to aggressively repel the endless waves of attackers. Every single strike they delivered only seemed to further enrage the massive and heavily intoxicated Australian mob surrounding the building. The arrival of heavily armed Australian military police officers, locally known as provosts, paradoxically managed to make the rapidly deteriorating tactical situation significantly worse. Instead of assisting their American counterparts in firmly restoring order, many of the sympathetic Australian guards actually turned a completely blind eye to the rioters. Some openly encouraged the massive destruction, feeling a deep sense of shared national kinship with the furious infantrymen who were violently attacking the American compound. This absolute breakdown in official command structure completely isolated the defending American personnel, leaving them entirely vulnerable to the surrounding mob. "We need backup right now. They are going to overrun the bloody building," a bleeding American guard desperately yelled over the deafening roar of the rioting crowd. Norbert Grant realized with terrifying clarity that their standard defensive tactics were completely useless against this massive and highly coordinated wave of sheer human fury. He drew his standard issue service weapon, explicitly aiming it toward the darkened sky in a desperate attempt to severely frighten the advancing mob into a sudden retreat. The metallic click of the safety being disengaged was completely drowned out by the incredible ambient noise. The sight of a drawn American firearm did absolutely nothing to quell the massive riot. Instead, it acted as the ultimate unforgivable provocation for the Australian soldiers. To the battle-hardened veterans of the Middle Eastern campaigns, the deployment of a lethal weapon in a simple street brawl was considered an act of supreme cowardice. "The bastard is pulling a gun on us! Get him!" Ted Webster roared fiercely, lunging forward with reckless abandon toward the heavily armed American officer. The crowd surged violently forward, a massive wave of khaki uniforms violently crashing against the desperate defensive line. In the terrifying chaos of the violent crush, the highly volatile situation finally crossed the definitive point of absolutely no return for anyone involved. American reinforcements desperately arrived in heavy military vehicles, brandishing loaded shotguns and completely demanding that the massive Australian crowd immediately disperse or face lethal consequences. The rioters simply responded by violently rocking the heavy military trucks, desperately attempting to forcefully overturn the vehicles and severely injure the trapped American occupants inside them. The darkened streets of the city were now completely unrecognizable, transformed into a highly dangerous and completely lawless combat zone. The violent clashes were no longer confined to the immediate vicinity of the American Post Exchange, having rapidly spread into the surrounding commercial districts. Vicious hand-to-hand combat erupted spontaneously in the dark alleyways, pitting former Allied brothers against each other in brutal and completely senseless displays of extreme physical violence. Civilians who had foolishly ventured out for the evening found themselves trapped in the terrifying crossfire, desperately fleeing the incredibly chaotic scenes of military anarchy. The absolute failure of diplomatic leadership had finally culminated in this massive and entirely preventable tragedy on the streets of Brisbane. Norbert Grant found himself violently separated from his defensive unit, desperately backed against a solid brick wall by a group of incredibly furious Australian infantrymen. He wildly swung his heavy wooden baton, trying to create enough physical distance to safely retreat toward the heavily fortified American military vehicles. Every single avenue of escape was completely blocked by a solid wall of extremely angry faces, screaming deeply insulting obscenities and demanding absolute physical retribution for perceived slights. The sheer intensity of the mob's collective hatred was profoundly overwhelming, completely paralyzing the normally highly disciplined military police officer. "You are not so tough without your bloody gun, are you, mate?" An incredibly large Australian soldier taunted aggressively, viciously punching Grant squarely in the face. The heavy blow violently knocked the American officer backward, his vision suddenly blurring as the extremely angry mob rapidly closed in to finish the brutal assault. Desperation completely overtook Grant's rigorous professional training, his terrified mind screaming that he was about to be beaten to death in this horrific foreign alleyway. In a blind panic, he reached for the loaded shotgun that a fellow officer had dropped during the initial chaotic scramble. The violent cacophony of the massive urban riot completely swallowed the desperate warning shouts of the few remaining rational men desperately trying to halt the madness. Ted Webster, deeply blinded by his own intense rage and profound nationalistic pride, forcefully shoved his way to the absolute front of the terrifyingly violent mob. He firmly intended to permanently teach the arrogant American military police a painful lesson they would never forget, utterly disregarding his own personal physical safety. He boldly stepped toward the deeply terrified Norbert Grant, completely unaware that he was stepping directly into a rapidly unfolding historical tragedy. The incredibly oppressive heat of the dark November night seemed to suddenly pause for a single, terrifyingly brief fraction of a suspended second. The massive crowd of angry Australian soldiers violently surged forward for another devastating attack against the desperately cornered and deeply terrified American military police officers. Grant, completely driven by pure survival instinct and overwhelming fear, firmly gripped the heavy shotgun and rapidly leveled the deadly weapon directly at the advancing human wave. The incredibly tense and highly explosive atmosphere had finally reached its absolutely inevitable and completely devastating breaking point in the heart of the city. The deafening roar of the furious soldiers completely masked the metallic sound of the heavy weapon being rapidly prepared to fire directly into the thick crowd. In that terrible moment, all the profound cultural misunderstandings, the bitter economic jealousies, and the deep racial tensions physically manifested in this single darkened alleyway. The once celebrated international military alliance that was supposed to save the Pacific region had brutally dissolved into a primitive and extremely bloody street war. Men who should have been standing firmly shoulder to shoulder against a common fascist enemy were now violently trying to destroy each other. For the terrified civilian residents listening to the massive destruction from behind their locked doors, the Thanksgiving evening had become an absolute living nightmare. The incredibly dense throng of enraged men continued to violently push forward against the desperate American defenders, leaving absolutely no room for peaceful negotiation or tactical retreat. Grant's trembling fingers slowly tightened around the cold steel trigger of the loaded shotgun as he braced himself for the inevitable physical impact. The tragic historical climax of the Battle of Brisbane was now only mere seconds away from violently unfolding upon the shattered pavement. The terrifying climax of the Battle of Brisbane erupted with a deafening blast that forever altered the historical trajectory of the Allied partnership. Norbert Grant, completely surrounded by a highly aggressive mob of furious Australian soldiers, frantically pulled the trigger of his heavy military shotgun in a desperate act of pure self-preservation. The incredibly loud explosion violently shattered the oppressive humidity of the dark November night, instantly freezing the massive riot in a terrifying moment of absolute shock. The bright muzzle flash briefly illuminated the deeply contorted faces of the furious men desperately fighting on Adelaide Street. Gunner Edward Webster, having forcefully pushed his way to the absolute front of the violently surging crowd, absorbed the devastating impact of the deadly scattergun blast at point-blank range. The heavy lead pellets violently tore through his chest, instantly halting his aggressive forward momentum and throwing his violently bleeding body backward onto the unforgiving street pavement. He gasped desperately for air, his life rapidly slipping away in the chaotic darkness of a city he had sworn to proudly defend. The deeply tragic irony of surviving brutal overseas combat only to die at home was completely inescapable. The terrifying sound of the deadly shotgun blast did not have the desired effect of safely dispersing the massive crowd of angry men. Instead of retreating in profound fear, the Australian soldiers erupted into an absolutely uncontrollable state of extreme, bloodthirsty vengeance upon seeing their fallen comrade bleeding heavily. "They have murdered one of our bloody boys. Kill the bastards," an unidentified Australian infantryman screamed frantically, completely shattering any remaining semblance of rational human restraint. The massive mob violently surged forward once again, completely overwhelming the deeply terrified American military police officers with sheer, overwhelming numbers. Several other Australian servicemen were also brutally struck by the rapidly expanding cloud of heavy lead projectiles discharged from the desperately fired weapon. Men fell screaming to the hard concrete pavement, clutching their severely bleeding wounds as the chaotic stampede of furious soldiers violently trampled over them. The darkened intersection of Adelaide Street literally ran red with the warm blood of Allied soldiers who had tragically turned their aggressive military training against one another. It was a scene of absolute, unimaginable horror that completely defied the noble democratic ideals heavily promoted by the wartime Allied leadership. Norbert Grant quickly realized that his desperate deployment of lethal defensive force had tragically doomed him and his fellow American officers to extreme physical violence. The massive mob violently descended upon the deeply terrified military police unit, forcefully stripping away their heavy defensive weapons and brutally beating them without any mercy. Grant was viciously repeatedly struck with heavy wooden objects and tightly clenched fists, his uniform rapidly becoming soaked in his own bright red blood. He barely managed to survive the initial brutal onslaught by desperately crawling underneath a heavily damaged American military transport vehicle parked nearby. The devastating news of Edward Webster being fatally shot by an American officer rapidly spread across the deeply congested urban center like wild electricity. Hundreds of heavily armed Australian servicemen abruptly abandoned their quiet evening drinks and frantically rushed toward the main intersection to actively join the massive violent riot. They viciously tore up heavy wooden picket fences to use as makeshift weapons, aggressively smashing every single glass window belonging to the American Post Exchange building. The deeply entrenched cultural resentments of the past entire year were finally being purged through absolute physical destruction and chaotic rage. Local civilian authorities and terrified medical personnel desperately attempted to bravely navigate the incredibly chaotic war zone to rapidly reach the bleeding Australian casualties. Ambulances loudly blared their warning sirens, but the massive throngs of deeply enraged fighting men completely blocked the narrow city streets, utterly refusing to safely yield. "You cannot save him now. The bloody Yanks have already killed him," a severely weeping Australian soldier bitterly shouted at a desperately struggling civilian paramedic. Webster lay completely motionless upon the dark pavement, a deeply tragic symbol of an immensely broken and highly dysfunctional international wartime alliance. Australian military authorities, suddenly realizing the absolutely catastrophic scale of the violently escalating urban mutiny, desperately ordered all available domestic troops back to their secure barracks. However, these urgent official military commands were completely ignored by the highly furious men who fundamentally felt that their own national leadership had completely failed them. The Australian provosts, initially deployed to forcefully restore order, largely stood by and silently watched as their angry comrades viciously dismantled the American military facilities. Some sympathetic Australian police officers even actively directed the massive rioting mobs toward other heavily guarded American logistical command buildings nearby. Inside the main American logistical headquarters, deeply terrified staff members frantically barricaded the heavy wooden doors and desperately loaded their heavy defensive firearms. General Douglas MacArthur was urgently informed of the massive violent uprising occurring just streets away from his supposedly secure International Military Command Center. The complete collapse of local civil order deeply threatened the fundamental operational integrity of the entire vital Pacific War effort during a highly critical strategic period. American commanders frantically debated whether to officially authorize the deployment of heavily armed combat units to violently suppress the massive and completely uncontrollable Australian rebellion. The violent and incredibly chaotic clashes relentlessly continued throughout the dark hours of the long, incredibly terrifying night, spreading like a deadly, uncontrolled virus. Any isolated American soldier unlucky enough to be caught alone on the darkened streets was immediately targeted and brutally beaten by massive gangs of extremely angry Australians. "This is for taking over our country, you arrogant Yankee bastards," screamed a violently raging Australian infantryman while viciously kicking a profoundly defenseless American sailor on the ground. The deeply civilized veneer of the modern city had been entirely stripped away, revealing only primitive and highly brutal tribal warfare. Deeply terrified civilian residents of Brisbane completely locked themselves inside their fragile suburban homes, anxiously listening to the terrifying sounds of absolute urban destruction, the chaotic breaking of expensive storefront glass, the terrifyingly loud crack of lethal military gunfire, and the intensely guttural screams of incredibly furious men echoed continuously. They fundamentally could not comprehend how their trusted and deeply celebrated international protectors had suddenly transformed into violently savage enemies, actively destroying their beloved peaceful city. The profound psychological trauma inflicted upon the terrified local population during that incredibly bloody night would permanently scar their historical collective wartime memory. Desperate attempts by highly respected Australian military officers to peacefully negotiate with the violently rioting mobs were met with extreme disrespect and immediate physical threats. The deeply furious enlisted men had completely lost all fundamental faith in their established military hierarchy, actively choosing to follow the chaotic momentum of the incredibly violent mob instead. They firmly believed that they were finally violently correcting a massive historical injustice that their deeply cowardly political leaders had completely failed to bravely address. The absolute lack of functional structural authority allowed the brutal street violence to continuously escalate entirely without any meaningful external restraint. By the desperately late hours of the highly chaotic night, The immediate vicinity surrounding the absolutely shattered American Post Exchange resembled a deeply horrific active war zone. Heavily damaged military vehicles burned frantically in the narrow streets, casting eerie and incredibly terrifying orange shadows across the heavily blood-stained concrete pavements. Deeply wounded men from both proud allied nations continuously groaned in immense physical agony as overworked civilian medical teams frantically attempted to forcefully extract them from the ongoing violence. The incredibly massive scale of the terrible physical destruction was completely unprecedented in the generally peaceful history of Australia. Norbert Grant, severely battered and deeply traumatized by the incredibly brutal physical assault, miraculously managed to slowly drag his bleeding body toward absolute safety. He fundamentally understood that his desperate decision to fire his weapon into the incredibly furious mob had irrevocably changed the nature of the critical Allied relationship. The tragic death of Gunner Edward Webster would forever stand as a deeply horrific symbol of the massive internal failures that plagued the celebrated international military coalition. The profound psychological weight of that terrible lethal decision would aggressively haunt the young American military police officer forever. As the chaotic violence slowly began to inevitably exhaust itself in the extremely early hours of the morning, the shattered city streets were heavily littered with massive debris. Exhausted Australian soldiers, completely drained of their intense adrenaline and profound nationalistic fury, slowly began to peacefully wander back toward their highly secure military encampments. They quietly left behind an incredibly massive trail of severe physical destruction and profound sorrow that would take heavily extensive political efforts to eventually repair. The incredibly terrible Battle of Brisbane had finally reached its deeply devastating and highly tragic physical climax. The deeply tragic loss of human life during this terrible internal military conflict completely shocked the entire political establishment of both closely allied fighting nations. High-ranking military officials forcefully scrambled to swiftly establish strict disciplinary curfews and immediately deploy heavily armed joint patrols to aggressively prevent further immediate violence. However, the terrible damage had already been brutally and permanently inflicted upon the incredibly fragile foundation of the vital wartime partnership between the fiercely proud democratic nations. The dark blood spilled upon the concrete pavement of Adelaide Street loudly demanded a massive and urgent political reckoning from leadership. The highly disturbing reality that Allied soldiers had actively murdered one another while desperately fighting a massive global war against terrifying fascism was deeply suppressed. Military censors immediately descended upon the chaotic city, aggressively confiscating all photographic evidence and strictly forbidding local newspaper editors from printing the honest historical truth. The incredible sacrifice of Edward Webster was quietly swept heavily under the political rug to fiercely protect the immensely important public image of General Douglas MacArthur. The brave Australian soldiers essentially realized that their deep personal suffering was entirely meaningless to the grand strategic machinery commanding the massive conflict. As the intense darkness of that horrific night slowly began to fade, the terrible magnitude of the sheer historical disaster became undeniably and deeply apparent. The bustling Australian capital city had been brutally transformed into a deeply shocking monument of profound Allied military failure and terrible, unrestrained human aggression. Every violently shattered glass window and heavily bloodied street corner served as a highly tragic and deeply enduring testament to the massive internal societal fractures. The highly celebrated United Front was proven to be an incredibly fragile political illusion shattered by intense local cultural friction and severe resource inequalities. The deeply terrified civilian populace cautiously emerged from their heavily secured homes the following morning, completely unable to genuinely comprehend the massive scale of destruction. They silently walked past the absolutely devastated American military installations, their collective hearts incredibly heavy with a profound sense of terrible grief and deep national betrayal. We invited them into our homes to desperately protect us, and they essentially brought the bloody war directly to our peaceful doorsteps, an elderly resident sadly whispered. The fundamental trust that initially welcomed the massive American military presence was entirely replaced by immense fear and enduring suspicion. This dark chapter of the massive global conflict forcefully highlighted the incredibly severe psychological toll that prolonged warfare brutally exacts upon young deployed soldiers. The massively intense pressures of constant military deployment, coupled with severe cultural misunderstandings, had ultimately pushed brave Allied men into unforgivable acts of pure violence. The terrible events firmly established that absolute unity within a massive military coalition requires significantly more than just a shared external political enemy to survive. The blood-stained streets of Brisbane would forever resonate as a massive historical warning about the severe dangers of unmanaged internal Allied friction. The harsh light of the morning sun slowly illuminated the terrible devastation scattered across the normally peaceful streets of the Australian city. Broken glass heavily blanketed the concrete sidewalks, glittering like dangerous diamonds amidst the heavily damaged military vehicles and discarded makeshift wooden weapons. Frightened municipal workers silently began the monumental task of sweeping away the extensive physical remnants of the unprecedented Allied military mutiny. The once vibrant and bustling wartime capital now resembled a deeply traumatized battleground, forever scarred by the intense internal violence of the previous horrific night. The official casualty reports were quietly circulated among the highest echelons of the Allied military command with a profound sense of absolute dread. Gunner Edward Webster lay dead in the local morgue, his tragic demise serving as the ultimate bloody sacrifice to the deeply flawed international partnership. Hundreds of other servicemen from both proud nations were severely confined to overflowing military hospital beds, nursing heavily bruised bodies and deeply fractured nationalistic egos. The sheer scale of the senseless physical violence completely shocked the seasoned military generals who mistakenly believed they fully controlled their respective armies. General Douglas MacArthur immediately recognized the profound strategic danger that this massive internal rebellion posed to his vital Pacific War effort against the Japanese. He furiously ordered his highest-ranking subordinate officers to ruthlessly crush any remaining whispers of local dissent and forcefully re-establish absolute operational control. Heavily armed joint patrols, explicitly consisting of both American and Australian military police officers, were hastily deployed to secure every single major street corner. A massive and completely inflexible evening curfew was severely imposed upon all Allied military personnel to actively prevent any further unauthorized nighttime civilian gatherings. The Australian government, completely terrified of irrevocably losing the absolute protection of the powerful United States military, hastily agreed to actively suppress the disastrous truth. Prime Minister John Curtin privately expressed his deep personal anguish regarding the senseless death of the brave Australian soldier on domestic soil. However, the overwhelming geopolitical necessity of maintaining the fragile defensive alliance firmly dictated that political pragmatism must completely override any basic sense of national justice. The highest levels of the Australian political establishment quietly decided that maintaining the appearance of absolute Allied unity was fundamentally more important than the truth. To actively protect this incredibly fragile illusion of international solidarity, the Allied military command swiftly implemented an absolutely draconian system of intense media censorship. Local newspaper editors received highly threatening late-night telephone calls from senior military intelligence officers, strictly forbidding any detailed reporting of the deadly street violence. The terrifying events of the previous evening were vaguely and dishonestly characterized as a minor localized disturbance that was quickly and peacefully resolved by authorities. Journalists who bravely attempted to publish the actual bloody facts were fiercely threatened with immediate imprisonment under the stringent wartime national security regulations. This massive wall of official bureaucratic silence only served to deeply deepen the profound anger burning within the hearts of the Australian servicemen. They fundamentally understood that their fallen comrade had been violently murdered, yet their own national government absolutely refused to publicly acknowledge the terrible crime. "They are sweeping poor Webster under the rug like he is nothing but dirty, bloody trash," a deeply bitter Australian infantryman angrily whispered to his remaining friends. This terrible realization of absolute political betrayal fundamentally destroyed any remaining trust the local soldiers had in their established military leadership structures. American military police officer Norbert Grant was eventually subjected to a highly secretive military court-martial procedure regarding his fatal deployment of lethal force. The heavily guarded military tribunal was conducted entirely behind closed doors, completely shielded from the intensely furious public scrutiny of the local civilian population. Grant honestly testified that he was violently surrounded by a massive and completely uncontrollable mob, actively threatening his life and the lives of his fellow officers. He firmly maintained that firing his heavy military shotgun was an absolutely necessary and fully justified defensive action required to survive the brutal assault. After an incredibly brief internal deliberation, the American Military Tribunal officially acquitted Norbert Grant of all major criminal charges related to the deadly shooting. The presiding military judges explicitly ruled that the young military police officer had acted entirely in lawful self-defense while executing his authorized official duties. When the deeply controversial verdict finally leaked to the intensely frustrated Australian military camps, it immediately sparked another massive wave of profound, silent fury. To the Australian veterans, the official acquittal was the ultimate devastating insult, officially confirming that American military lives were fundamentally valued above their own. The incredibly somber funeral for Gunner Edward Webster was deliberately conducted with absolutely minimal official fanfare to actively prevent any further public military uprisings. A small, heavily monitored gathering of deeply mourning family members and fiercely loyal military comrades stood silently around the freshly dug local grave. Heavily armed military intelligence agents discreetly watched the solemn proceedings from the nearby shadows, desperately ready to aggressively crush any sudden spontaneous displays of violent rebellion. The deeply tragic burial of the young Australian soldier vividly symbolized the incredibly high human cost of maintaining a profoundly dysfunctional international military coalition. Following the deeply devastating riot, the Allied Military High Command was forcefully compelled to actively implement several sweeping administrative changes across the capital city. New recreational facilities and heavily subsidized canteens were finally established explicitly for the desperately neglected Australian military personnel to help ease their intense resentment. The informal geographical segregation of the massive military forces was officially formalized, creating strict, invisible borders that soldiers from either nation were fiercely discouraged from crossing. While these desperate structural measures slowly managed to significantly reduce the frequency of violence, the underlying mutual hatred absolutely remained completely unresolved. The deeply traumatized civilian population of Brisbane incredibly struggled to safely navigate the newly imposed absolute authoritarian atmosphere dominating their once peaceful hometown. The heavily armed joint military patrols marching aggressively through the local commercial districts constantly reminded the frightened citizens of the profound internal danger. They quietly mourned the terrible loss of their innocent wartime innocence, fundamentally realizing that the celebrated Allied saviors were perfectly capable of delivering immense destruction. The deeply romanticized international vision of a purely noble democratic alliance was permanently shattered upon the violently bloody pavement of the dark Adelaide Street intersection. The incredibly powerful American military machine continued its massive logistical preparations for the brutal island-hopping campaigns, completely undeterred by the severe local bloodshed. The thousands of newly arriving American servicemen were strictly briefed regarding the intense dangers of violently interacting with the deeply hostile local Australian troops. They were explicitly warned to absolutely avoid certain darkened neighborhoods and completely ignore any aggressive, verbal taunts from the highly resentful Allied soldiers. The profound international military partnership had effectively devolved into an incredibly tense and heavily armed truce, carefully managed by strict disciplinary threats and overwhelming force. For the fiercely proud Australian soldiers, the terrible Battle of Brisbane remained a deeply defining psychological moment of their difficult domestic wartime experience. They fiercely carried the bitter memory of the massive riot with them as they eventually deployed to the incredibly brutal jungle battlefields of New Guinea. The absolute lack of basic respect demonstrated by the American military command permanently altered their fundamental perception of their massive and highly wealthy international allies. They bravely fought alongside the Americans against the Japanese, but the genuine fraternal bond of true military brotherhood had been entirely and violently severed. The extremely heavy blanket of official historical censorship proved to be incredibly effective in actively erasing the terrible event from the broader global consciousness. For many long decades following the ultimate conclusion of the massive global conflict, the incredibly bloody mutiny was rarely mentioned in official historical textbooks. It was quietly relegated to the shadowy realm of local urban legends, whispered quietly by aging veterans in the dark corners of quiet local pubs. The respective national governments were perfectly content to let the deeply embarrassing historical episode slowly fade entirely into complete international obscurity and convenient forgetfulness. However, the deeply tragic ghosts of the horrific Battle of Brisbane absolutely refused to be completely silenced by the massive bureaucratic machinery of government censorship. Dedicated local historians and fiercely persistent journalists eventually began to carefully unearth the highly classified military documents, heavily detailing the devastating internal military conflict. They bravely reconstructed the chaotic timeline of the massive riot, finally giving a desperately needed historical voice to the terrified men who had violently fought there. The undeniable truth of the terrible bloodshed eventually emerged from the heavy shadows, challenging the deeply sanitized official narrative of the celebrated war. The completely unvarnished historical reality of the massive Allied mutiny serves as a profoundly powerful warning regarding the intense internal complexities of coalition warfare. It definitively proves that merely sharing a massive external geopolitical enemy is absolutely never enough to magically erase deep cultural divides and severe economic inequalities. The profound psychological stress of an existential global conflict can rapidly amplify seemingly minor civilian disagreements into massive and highly destructive episodes of absolute violence. The incredibly bloody streets of the Australian capital effectively demonstrated that the most dangerous enemies sometimes wear the very same Allied military uniforms,